South China Morning Post, 23 November 2022. Economic ties between China and Canada begin a cold coexistence period as political mistrust increases. Chinese interference in the Canadian election process and hostage diplomacy used to extort and coerce Canada are both illegal. Experts say that after years of tensions and a more significant trend of Western diversification away from the world's number 2 economy, Canadian policymakers are becoming more strict on business connections with China, their second largest trading partner behind the United States. Trade is anticipated to remain stable because both sides depend on one another, but Ottawa is becoming more cautious about investments and significant economic alliances with China. The director of the China program at the Stimson Centre in Washington, Yun Sun, said that this does not imply that they will cut off their connections with China. But it does mean they aim to exercise greater caution and vigilance over the implications. Mélanie Joly, Canada's foreign minister, has recently cautioned domestic businesses against expanding their business ties with China owing to political concerns. Ottawa has ordered 3 Chinese companies to stop investing in lithium mines connected to Canadian security interests. Later in October, Canada also declared its intention to join the US-led Indo-Pacific Economic Framework Alliance, which is considered a check on China's economic might. After carefully walking a fine line with Beijing for several, the Canadian government does seem to be suggesting a possibly harder attitude toward China, according to Vincent Rigby, senior consultant at the Washington-based Centre for Strategic and International Studies. A Hydro-Quebec employee was recently accused of spying by Canadian authorities, who believe they were gathering trade secrets for China. According to a statement from the business, the suspect was a researcher who studied battery materials. Canada sees batteries as strategically important. The Canadian government prohibited a Chinese business from purchasing an Arctic gold mine 2 years ago, citing security concerns. Last month, the government's Global Affairs Canada spokeswoman, Law McCodre, declared that Ottawa is no longer pursuing a free trade pact with China. The deal is listed as under discussion on the Chinese Ministry of Commerce website after extensive consensus was achieved to examine the deal's viability in 2017. Zhao Lijian, a Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs spokesman, claimed that Joly's warning was unfounded and described it as an intrusion into domestic affairs. According to ministry spokesperson Mao Ning on Thursday, China is not to blame for the recent misunderstandings with Canada. According to Victor Gao, vice president of the Center for China and Globalization in Beijing, Chinese investors complain about a lack of an adequate explanation about restrictions put in place by Canada based on national security. Gao added that why Canada would increase monitoring of its operations, there is somewhat of a mystery to China. Despite hopes for improvement, Zhang Jiwei, president and chief economist at Pinpoint Asset Management in Shanghai, stated that policy uncertainty is rather significant. Analysts claim that Canada's longer-term pivot away from China is fueled by the global and American perception of China's misdeeds. They add that Canadian officials are finding it more straightforward to collaborate with President Joe Biden on this topic than with his predecessor Donald Trump. Edwin Lai, associate director of the Center for Economic Policy at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, said, "Maybe they follow Biden more because Trump was deemed more extremist." The US and other Western nations are concerned about issues of national security as well as an excessive reliance on commerce with China. In 2018, US authorities started a trade conflict with China by imposing tariffs on $500 million worth of Chinese imports. Beijing claims that some Chinese tech companies pose a threat to its national security. A diplomatic conflict between China and Australia has also imposed tariffs on Australian exports. China's zero-COVID policy is still causing supply chain problems, causing worry in the West. Canada seems to be leaning more toward the stronger stances taken by its allies, such as the US and Australia, noted Rigby, who also serves as a visiting professor at the McGill University School of Public Policy in Montreal. According to Stephen Nagy, senior scholar at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute think tank in Ottawa, the deterioration in Sino-Canadian relations shows no signs of normalizing anytime soon. According to Nagy, Canadian officials may struggle to create a rational China policy and instead experience awkward frigid coexistence. According to some observers, the two countries' political issues have created a pervasive background for continued economic friction. Meng Wanzhou, the financial chief of Huawei Technologies, was placed under house arrest by Canada from 2018 to 2021. Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, Two Canadians who had been held for nearly 3 years on suspicion of spying were released by Beijing after Meng was granted permission to return to China. According to Sun, nobody should anticipate that events will return to normal as if nothing happened. A living reminder of the kind of power China is, and the kind of coercion it is ready to use to get its way when things don't accord, she said of the political cases for Canada. The two Michaels' alleged espionage case drove Canada to reject the free trade agreement, according to Jeremy Paltiel, an emeritus professor of political science at Carleton University in Ottawa. Officials in Canada generally seek to strike a balance between trade and human rights. According to Nagy, exporters in Western Canada want to continue sending raw materials to China even while national officials keep an eye on how Beijing treats the country's ethnic minorities to limit participation. According to estimates from the University of Alberta's China Institute, the measurable effects of China on Canada's GDP likely surpass $55 billion. According to customs figures from Ottawa, Canada exported a total of 28.84 billion Canadian dollars, $21.62 billion to China last year, an increase of 14% from the previous year. China receives mainly coal from Canada. Last year, China delivered commodities worth $51.51 billion to Canada, most of which were machinery, electronics, and electrical equipment. According to the University of Alberta, pandemic lockdowns in China have forced the closure of eateries, hurting exports of Canadian pork and soybeans. A $2.8 billion Canadian soybean harvest has been further harmed by the enduring degradation of sino-Canadian political relations, claims the Soy Canada Trade Association. After the Ming dispute erupted, China halted importing Canadian canola and pork products, but it lifted 3-year-old import restrictions on Canadian canola seeds in May. Despite their differences, Canada will continue its general economic and trade relations with China due to its importance in the world, according to Rigby. According to a Canadian government spokesman, one-way trade has again reached pre-pandemic levels. Despite the challenges in our relationship, she vowed that Canada would continue to treat China with respect. Whatever is in the best interests of Canadians and consistent with our values will always drive our trade policy. According to Lai, Canada's economy would profit from opening trade rather than restricting trade, given the escalating economic problems in Western nations, including the potential for a recession. Most investment avenues will continue to be accessible, according to Paltiel. According to Paltiel, Canada is generally open to Chinese investment, except sectors where national security is at risks, such as primary metals or other minerals not considered strategic. However, given the trend of declined investment offers, it is not unexpected that Chinese investors, particularly those from state-owned companies, would not feel welcome in this country. Chinese businesses are all state-owned, they are only nominally privately owned.